Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me, Peter Hurst from MIT, in our latest LinkedIn Live event from MIT Sloan Executive Education. Today, I am really pleased to be joined once again with my colleague and friend, George Westerman, who's a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management, principal research scientist at the J-Well Workforce Learning lab. George will be talking a little bit about both those aspects of his work at MIT in our conversation today. He works at the intersection of executive leadership and technology strategy. He's been here at MIT well over 17, 18 years at the Sloan School of Management. He's the author of 3 award-winning books. He really is recognized as a pioneering researcher on digital transformation. He's published papers widely, including in Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, and other top journals. And now his focus is really on helping employers, educators, and other groups to rethink the process of workforce learning around the world. The list goes on. George is a co-chair of the MIT Sloan CIO Leadership Awards, a member of the Digital Strategy Roundtable for the US Library of Congress, and a faculty director, as many of you know, of some of our executive education programs, both open enrollment and custom, here at the MIT Sloan School. I'll stop there, otherwise I could spend the whole hour just introducing George and his works. But really, George, thank you so much for joining us. And if I may just say to everyone who's logged in as well, please do feel free to post comments in the LinkedIn stream. We'd love to see your questions coming in. I'll do my best to keep an eye on those and ask George any questions that you may have as we go along. But just to get started and make sure that you're typing in into the LinkedIn stream, why don't you share with us where you're calling in from or dialing in from? Where in the world are you? And if you'd also like to add, what's one thing that you hope that you will go away from this particular discussion, having learned a little bit more about? We'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as possible. So George, welcome once again. Thank you for being here.
Well, it's great to be here. We've never done a LinkedIn Live with you. It's a nice experiment. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, we're always trying to innovate using technology here as well. Of course, it kind of the clue is in the name of our employer, I suppose. And again, just for the audience's sake, sometimes people have presentations and slides and that kind of thing in these settings. We're not doing that. This is a conversation between George and myself. So don't worry if you're not seeing any slides coming up. That's not a bug. That's a feature of today's event.
And if you've seen the way I draw slides, you're better off not seeing them.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a challenge for some of us, George. But I think that from doing these things with you in the past, this time will absolutely fly by. And I'm seeing people coming in now from literally all over the world. So thank you again for joining us. And George, perhaps to kick us off, when we were talking before we got going with the formal event, one of the concepts that we were talking about was how much in the past, when we've talked about IT and technology and its and the possibilities of IT and technology, we felt like we're trying to push businesses and organizations to adopt new technologies. The metaphor people often talk about is, IT was a hammer and it was out there looking for nails that were, actual applications. And in some respects, over the last 18 months, we've had, in a variety of ways, some really great illustrations of what happens when you switch that around and when actually you've got very clear applications that are looking for technology. And so you have an application pull instead of a technology push. What have you seen over the last 18 months that sort of as a result of that kind of reframing?
It's really fascinating. My wife is a doctor, and we've been doing telehealth for decades. Just nobody was really doing it. And now suddenly she's doing it every day. And our teaching, Peter, you and the team swapped us over overnight to make digital learning happen. We weren't sure people wanted it, but people like it. It actually works really pretty well. It's convenient. And so that I think you're right. There were technologies waiting for use that people didn't want to use. Now we're the other side. A critical element of the technology adoption process, looking back at penicillin and seed corn and everything up for a century, is this idea of comparative advantage. Will you be better having adopted this than if you haven't? And so this idea that people now have a problem they're looking for help with, it's a joy. It's a total joy for the technology people. On the other hand, there's still some impatience. And the impatience is the technology is there. Why can't you make it work? Well, there's still an awful lot of other stuff that needs to be arranged. You need to link it in with what you're doing in your legacy platforms. You need to figure out how to rearrange your processes and some of your other elements in there. So it's not a direct slam dunk, but it's certainly a lot better than it was in the past for some technology people.
That's interesting. You touched there on the idea that oftentimes business users, business leaders may have some frustrations that with how technology is implemented and whether it really delivers in some ways on the kinds of great promise there is. Mm-hmm. How much of what you're describing there goes back to a concept that you talked about in a paper a few years ago now? I think the title was something like IT is from Venus and business is from Mars or something like that. Maybe you can tell me the exact quote and explain how that relates to this challenge.
It's sometimes I still find writing hard, but occasionally one just flies right off your fingers. And this is one of the ones that just flew right off my fingers. And it's kind of nice. It's very, we teach this course called Essential IT for the Non-IT Executive. And the whole point is to help business folks get a feeling for the concepts and the language so they can work better with IT. And when I ask people why they're there, almost always somebody says, those IT people are just difficult. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, right? And then other people will say, IT is a black hole. It's like a black hole. We keep dumping resources into it and nothing ever escapes. And these are, we also hear things like the CIO should be called the CI. No, because they never do what we want. And this is really interesting because to me, it sounds like when you've got couples that need a little bit of therapy. And that's how this Venus and Mars article came out. It's as hard as it is for business people to deal with IT, it's just as hard on the IT side. And it's not that anyone, well, sometimes people are doing some things wrong, but it's not usually that people are doing things wrong. It's just they're seeing the problem from different angles and they need to find a way to meet in the middle. So if you want, I can kind of go through a couple elements in here, but it's up to you, Peter.
Yeah, sure. And I think you've probably got some quite good examples of those language barriers.
Sure, yeah, great. So, we hear from the business side. And by the way, if this were a couples therapy session, a lot of it would be what was said and what was heard, right? And so, the IT side, it's always IT costs too much. We're not getting what we're paying for. And that's on the business side. On the IT side, they're often saying, actually, given everything we've got to do, we actually don't have enough money to do what needs to be done. And in fact, it's hard to do the right thing because we haven't had the money to clean up the mess we had. So that's an interesting standpoint. Who's right, who's wrong? It's probably in the middle somewhere, right? Another one is, I need this right away. Well, that's true. Just you need to know that 3 other executives have said the same thing to me this week. And so how do you expedite? How do you figure out the expediting process? Another one is, I want it this way. And the technology people say, you can't have it that way. The right answer is there's a better way to do it. And so you have to learn how to bridge that gap. So these are all interesting ways that, we have different perspectives on the problem. And what we try to do in this course is help people get a better understanding of what the real situation is so you can communicate, you can make better decisions to get there.
That's great. I love that notion of marriage counseling for the marriage between IT and business. A lot of people might, though, looking at the news this week, it's all about huge technology companies, and so I guess there's some sense in which oftentimes now sort of IT and technology is somehow driving or thinks it can be driving the business. Is that something as a phenomenon that that you've seen shifting over the last few years?
Yeah, so certainly over the last during the time I've been at MIT, this shift has happened. This concept that IT used to be a back office function, that the idea was, hey, you do what we ask you to. And unfortunately, we've taught IT people too that the internal customer is always right. But it's actually, you're not always right. you have the idea what you want to do, but that may not be the right way given everything else is. Every customization you ask for creates risk and cost and slowness for the next change that you want to make. Right. And if you have this favorite technology vendor and it doesn't link to others, that means you're going to have staff to support that other vendor. You're going to have costs of supporting that other vendor forever. And so, we do want to think about how can you talk differently to these people? What can you do? So let's get back to your original question, though. Is there a change that's been going on? The change is this. It's from order taker to strategic partner. And when I first started at MIT, that was just emerging. I wrote a book in 2010, won a bunch of awards on how to become that strategic partner when you're IT. It was called The Real Business of IT, but it was still not a very common thing. And I would say now, if you are not in a situation where your IT people are true partners, they're part of that conversation from the beginning, then you're just asking for trouble. Because, as you said, Peter, technology is changing so quickly, and the opportunities from technology are so big now that if you're not doing it, your competitors are. So long answer to say, got to get that IT person to be at the table with you. And that doesn't mean fire your CIO. Sometimes it does, but almost never. What it really means is find ways to bridge that gap, to have better decision-making, better understanding where you're going on both sides.
Great, thank you, George. And just as an aside, I see some folk are sharing their personal connection details in the LinkedIn Live stream. Thanks for doing it, but please try to keep that to a bit of a minimum so people can follow the conversation in LinkedIn as well. So, George, you were mentioning there a few times that the term IT, and we were just talking about language earlier on in the introduction. I mentioned that really a lot of your work is in the field of digital transformation, and that's certainly become a real buzzword, especially since the pandemic, even more so. Are digital and IT synonyms? How should we think about these things?
You can certainly think about digital as the next wave of IT. Many people think about IT as back office and digital as front office. I think digital is throughout it. So the way I think about it is that somewhere around 2010, we have evolved a bunch of technologies: mobile, cloud, better analytics, sensors in the operational side, that opened up new possibilities for speed, for recombinant innovation in ways that we couldn't before. And so that's the next generation of IT. So I would see it as an evolution. And that evolution, there's some new stuff, the way we engage with customers, but the old stuff still matters.
Okay, so there's some language change, and in some of your writing as well, I've noticed that you talk a lot about something which might be surprising to people who are thinking about technology, IT, digital, and so forth, and that's the term mindset and changing mindsets. What do you mean by that?
There are an awful lot of ways that we operated pre-digitally that we need to rethink about. So somebody who's got as much gray hair as I do lived in an age, PCs were just coming out when I started working, and they weren't networked together. Networking meant sticking a floppy disk in and carrying it to somebody else, and you never carried it down the hall or to another building. Then the internet came, and then mobile came, and all these things. And yet many of us, having grown up in the pre-digital world, have some ideas on how things work, and they may not be true anymore. So really critical to thinking about this idea of digital transformation is to rethink what's possible and rethink those rules you've got in your head, that little person on your shoulder who says that'll never work. So for example, customers really want the personal touch. They really want the human touch. No, they actually want personal service, but they may not want it from a person, especially in the age of COVID. We've learned that, right? And so computers, if they can give you a personal touch, that may be enough. Another one we've learned in COVID, people, if we think that people aren't productive when they're not at work, well, I think we need to rethink that assumption. So that's the idea. The mindset is there's so much in our heads, so much in our organizational cultures that are based on pre-digital assumptions of how things work. And we really need to sit back and reevaluate some of those assumptions. Not all of them are wrong, but all of them need some consideration.
Great. So, that sounds eminently sensible. How do we do that? How do we actually test these? How do we identify our assumptions, and how do we test them, and how do we evaluate alternative assumptions?
So I've been doing this with a number of companies lately, and it's this idea of just surfacing your assumptions. You got to get started, and then we find that groups tend to move really quickly at that point to identify more. What's really useful in this process is to invite some really young people into the room, because it turns out that many of those things well, let me just say it differently. When I was 20 and entering a company, I was told over and over again, "Shut up, kid. That's not how the world works." And they said it nicer than that, but that's what and so I learned not to ask certain questions. And yet those questions are actually really interesting. Why do we do it this way? Why can't we do it a different way? So surfacing the assumptions, people can figure out how to do it as we get started, but then you want to bring some diversity in the room. And certainly having the young people in the room, having people from different units in the room, from customer facing and back end facing, get them in a room to surface these assumptions, and then the discussions get really interesting.
That is interesting. Something a practice I've always had, and maybe I just lucked my way into it. It wasn't with such a robust framework, because you're describing, when onboarding new people into the organization, is always to say, look, you've got fresh eyes. Don't assume that because we're doing something a particular way that there's any real rationale or justification for that. It might just be that we've always done it this way and it's never occurred to us to try something different. So please speak up and point these things out. And, we welcome those kinds of questions.
That's a real credit to you. And I know how your people think of you. And so that's great. But also maybe, you're a very innovative group. I didn't realize that might have been the source of some of the innovations. It's a great idea.
Sure. So, it's one thing to say we're open to it, but then you've actually got to figure out how to try these things out, test them, evaluate them. Is there an approach that you're seeing, particularly in the realm of IT, now rebadged as digital, where sometimes the scale of the costs is eye-watering?
Mm-hmm.
And the consequences of making some of those big decisions and getting them wrong early on could be very significant. And we're probably all familiar with some pretty major IT misses over the years. So what are you seeing? When this talk is about IT for non-IT execs. So what's the kind of advice that you're giving to non-IT execs for? Okay, we can get new ideas in here. Let's say we bought into that. We can sort of challenge our assumptions. But how do we know which ones to go with? How do we test that out?
So first of all, find a group of some kind in your organization that's willing to act at the speed and the experimental way that you are. And that's not normal for a lot of IT organizations. So IT units often they can create an innovation unit, or you may have a digital unit that does this kind of thing. And so that's the first thing. This idea of speed, fail fast, is critical in this environment. And that's just not normal, especially for IT people, because IT people tend to get lots of requests that are hard to deliver, and then they get slammed when they don't happen, whether or not they had the authority to make them happen. So number one, find a small group or bigger group that has that right mentality, that right culture, that speed, and then just try them. And really critical in there is this idea of fail fast, fail cheap. So can you do an experiment that doesn't, maybe at one facility, or even an internal experiment based on data, or something else like that, where you can just try it, and then if it works, you continue on. One of the challenges we run into over and over again is the idea that we get committed to our idea rather than committed to the results. And so you got to be able to do an experiment that's well designed and then cut it off if it doesn't work. Try something else. Only carry the others forward. So, find the group that has that right mentality, find the cheap experiments, and then build on the ones that work well. One more thing about that. You may try the experiment using some quick and dirty technology. There may be an effort that's involved to kind of make that scalable, make it more bulletproof over time. So be ready for that too.
Great. And just drilling down on that a little bit, Mark Saab on the LinkedIn feed asked, what techniques do you find useful in stratifying the assumptions?
Stratifying the assumptions. Not quite sure what you mean. What we'll often do is we'll put them on the board and we'll then cluster them into groups. So I've got a series of articles coming out in Slow Management Review that talk about assumptions around how we work, assumptions around what customers want, and assumptions about how we drive transformation. So if by stratifying you mean clustering, actually groups are really pretty good at that, at lumping these together into common areas. If you mean something else by stratifying, then pop it back in the chat and we'll try to get back to it.
Sure, but it's kind of interesting that even now, what I heard you say there, George, was what you said. I took away post-it notes on whiteboards was kind of a tool. Of course, there are digital versions of that have really come into their own, especially during sort of these lockdown phases as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's a lot being written about we really don't need to be going into the office in person to participate in these processes? Are you a fan of that view, or are you a fan of the view that really technology is going to enable us to work in a much more remote and distributed kind of way as effectively?
I have been both shocked and delighted by how much we've been able to do with technology from working from home. I also am delighted by the idea that it's making us revisit some of those questions we just have put off for many years about where people work and why they work and that kind of thing. Having said that, we have started our first in-person thinking together sessions for the lab that I'm in. And there's just something about being in person. There's something about being in that session, being able to, while you're at the coffee machine, talk to each other, talking to each other in the bathroom, right? That you just can't do in the digital world the same way. So I do believe that we will stay at least partially digital in a lot of things, but I see a lot of value in that, that in-person time. Peter, I don't know, how are you doing it? We're talking in our lab about having, one day we have to be there and another day we ought to be there. And that's almost working. We're getting there. How are you doing it with your team?
Yeah, so the executive team here at Sloan, some folk may have seen us writing about this over the years. Really, about 5 years ago, we moved to a much more sort of flexible and agile. And I would like to come back to that agile term actually in a moment, George, with you. Way of working, where pre-pandemic we said, if there's any job that anyone is doing here in our team that can't be done remotely at least 2 days a week, then we'll re-examine that job so that everybody can have access to sort of more work-life balance and not having to commute every day and so forth. And of course, we went totally virtual during the pandemic, and we were more able to do that, I think, because of the experience that we'd already had. That has begged a really interesting question of how are we going to come back? Are we just going to go back to what we were doing before, which worked very well, about probably 60, 70, 80% of the time in the office, the rest remote. Right now, I think, we polled the team and the answer is, well, probably that balance is switched, probably less than 50% in person, more than 50% remote. But we're not there yet, because I think one thing that we've learned, and I'm interested whether people in the LinkedIn feed, if you've got experience of this, we'd love to hear about it as well. That, of course, we're not really through the pandemic yet either. So there are a lot of things like having to wear masks in the office and that kind of thing, which make actually being on camera, being able to see your face, better than perhaps being standing next to you in a building, but not being able to see your face. Where will we be, when we don't have to wear masks anymore? I think the needle will have changed for sure. I think the balance has gone in favor of less time together, but not no time for us anyway.
It's interesting what you said, that you realize that you need to redesign the jobs sometimes to make them work in a better. And I don't know that people have thought that hard about that in many companies. That everybody went remote, but that doesn't mean it was the right people were remote, and some people had to still be in the office. So this idea of redesigning is a really important concept.
Yes, I think sort of designing and redesigning work, and designing and redesigning the organization as well.
Cool, great.
I mentioned the term agile, and I said I wanted to come back to that. It's going back to the theme that you were developing, talking about testing assumptions and trying experiments. There is perhaps an idea, particularly again among sort of business executives who are not so well versed in technology, that all we have to do is move from this thing called waterfall to this thing called agile, and all this magic will happen. Is that an accurate worldview, or is that an example of the kinds of assumptions that you were talking about we actually need to challenge?
So, if you are a great executive, you have learned to delegate really well. And if you delegate to the right people, you don't need to worry about a problem anymore. It's just something that you give it to somebody, it'll happen. Occasionally you'll hear about it. And you just can't do that in IT because the IT people have the technology, but you own the processes that they're changing. And it has to be a much more joined up process. So this idea that you could completely delegate delivery of projects was never right. And in Agile, it's even more important. So if you're doing Agile right, somebody from the business team is going to be there full time or close to full time because they're going to be the delegate that makes the call for product decisions, process decisions, these kinds of things. And if you're not willing to do that, then Agile is not going to work for you. I know a lot of IT organizations that say they're doing Agile, and all they're doing is the Agile methods, but they're leaving out that critical part of having a product or process owner in the room because that person won't be there, and they're not going to get there. If I could say one other thing about Agile, it is, if you're not doing Agile, you need to start. It is the way that IT needs to work. It's the way that digital works. And it's actually better. It seems like you're speeding up IT. You're putting more accountability on IT. You'd think they wouldn't like it, but it's actually better for the IT workers too. But that doesn't mean everything has to be Agile. And so another challenge you've got in the organization, or challenge or opportunity you got, is figuring out where the old way is better and where the new way is better. And the new way tends to be better for when you don't understand what the requirements are, when you're innovating regularly to try to figure out what customers want. The Agile works really well. If you're updating your financial systems, if you're putting your ERP system in place, that may not need an Agile approach because, first of all, the requirements are really well known. And second of all, they're big projects with big risks if you have to rework them. So if you're not doing Agile, do it. Try to be smart about when you're doing it and when you're not. And if you're trying to do Agile without giving some of your people to that team, you're not really doing Agile.
Right. So Agile also, it occurs to me, fits very well with the notion of the change management that you need to go through, and that we need organizations to change, and alongside the IT investments. And Fernando asked a question about that, which I want to come to in a second. But just to sort of set that up, there's this thing which some people have called George's law that's relevant to that. Could you just tell us what your framing of that of so-called George's law is, and how it's relevant to this change management question?
Let me come back to a comment that was in the links, and then come back to that. Somebody had said, "You think that Agile ought to be across the whole organization?" Absolutely, that's where you want to go, but that doesn't mean you're going to be there right away, right? The best companies I know, certainly the digital companies, many of them have been born that way, and they get that way. Larger companies have to find a way to work it. And so often it comes in as an experiment in IT, it grows across IT, and then it moves out to the product units. So you're right. In an ideal world, the whole company would be Agile. There's just a process of getting there. Right? So now back to George's law. Yeah, there is certainly, those of you who know Moore's law says technology doubles in power every 18 to 24 months. It's an exponential story. And if you think about it that way, let's say it's 18 months. That means every 10 years, every 5 years, technology is 10 times as good as it was before. Every 10 years, technology is 100 times as good as it was before. And that means if you're using the old idea of 5-year strategic planning, your plan is 10 times out of date when you start. And so we need a different way of thinking about that. That's how Agile can work. So I want to give you my law. My law is technology changes quickly, organizations change much more slowly. What that means is you can't think about this just as a technology problem, that in the digital transformation concept, transformation is even more important than digital because it's the harder problem, right? The way to think about it is technology provides no value to companies. The value comes when you use that technology to change the way you do business. And I think when we do this technology conversation, we often forget that. Technology vendors forget that when they're selling you the technology. Business people forget that when they ask IT people to do things and then they walk out of the room. And we need to remember it's about the transformation as much about the digital. Otherwise, it's just not going to work.
Great. So let me return to Fernando's question, which if we can perhaps put you on the spot slightly, George, because Fernando was thinking about a particular area of business. He was looking at sales and asking, how would you set about trying to transform a sales organization from being sort of a traditional transactional kind of function to something which is digitally transformed. But here we are. I see the question just come.
Okay. So listen, we see we updated our work recently. We have an article called "The New Elements of Digital Transformation," and we identified 4 places you can look for challenges there. Look for opportunities. One's the customer experience. Another is the operations. Another is business models, and a new emerging one is employee experience. So what I'd suggest the place to start is the customer journey. If you're in sales, what is the customer journey? What does it look like for the customer to engage with you? Where is it working? Where is it not working? I would immediately do the same thing for an employee journey. Your sales staff, your sales support staff, what does it look like for them to go through the process of doing a sales engagement, of bringing a customer on board? Looking at those 2 things first will identify challenges in the way you operate and some opportunities you can go at. So number 1, gather the data, find out where the opportunities are. Number 2, then create a vision for where you want to go. Create a picture of what the right sales organization would look like. And then start building out experiments or capability investments or back office investments to make that, to move towards that direction. The worst thing you can do is say, hey, I'm a sales guy, I know exactly the answer. No, you got to go out and gather some data, and then you incrementally move. Do something, see how it's working, move again, move again.
Interesting. So in all of these examples, the thing that you said early on in our conversation keeps coming back to my mind, that this all looks like a lot of costs from a business perspective. And historically, IT has always been a cost center. It shows up essentially as an expense in all of the accounting reports. What are some? But I've heard you talk about really changing that mindset and really thinking, how do we describe and understand these as investments as opposed to costs?
Yeah.
Are there any examples that you have where you've really seen that working?
One of the things we talk to IT people about is how what they say puts them in a box they don't want to be in. And I mentioned earlier, the business is my customer. Well, that puts you in a situation where you're a vendor, and none of us treat our vendors very well, right? So you don't want to be there. Another one is to say, well, we're a cost of doing business, because what you're really saying is cut me, reduce me year on year. And so this idea is what the IT people need to learn how to do is show the value of what they're doing. And they're going to show that value in 2 ways. The first way they're going to do is that all the operational stuff need to find a way that they could show they're delivering the right services for the right price for the right level of quality. And that's through benchmarks, it's through unit costs, it's through all kinds of other elements that you just start talking this way. And the more you talk about it, the better you get at delivering. Also, the better you get for the other side to see the value you're delivering from a pure operational side. Now we move on to the projects. And these product investments that you were talking about, Peter, number 1, this should be a joint decision on what you're doing. It should be joint accountability. And then you need to come back again and figure out whether you got what you expect. So we call this the virtuous cycle of IT, where if you're transparent about what you want, if you're transparent about responsibility, and you're transparent about the results you get, you then create a cycle of learning over and over again, where everybody understands what's working and what's not and where you go. That cycle is becoming even faster in the digital world. So when we wrote this book in 2010 and talked about it, that could have been a year-long cycle. Now we're talking the agile world, weeks or days, or in some digital companies, you're putting things out several times a day. And so what you need to do is get very clear on what does it mean to be better, so that as you put these things out there, you can test it. Long answer there, Peter. Sorry, that was a whole book in in about 3 or 4 minutes. But really critical from the business side is understanding not only what you want, but what's going to change and how you're going to measure it. And that will help you all get better about understanding these innovations you put out, whether they're working, whether they're not.
Interesting. That as you were just finishing up there, I saw a question coming from Angelique asking about essentially why different parts of the C-suite are not able to collaborate as well as perhaps we all wish sometimes that they would in pursuit of these kind of sort of shared benefits. You've worked with probably a particular subset of CXOs. Is that a phenomenon that you've seen? And how, when you're advising these very senior executives, what are some of the tips that you give them to improve on that situation?
So, Angelique, you mentioned actually two very, very different types of people, right? The CMO are about fast, innovative, quick hit impact that's going to really thrill your customers. And there's a lot more, right? The good ones also understand about having a great process behind and a great set of tools. But the mindset is get things done quickly and get them out there. And if we waste a little bit of money, that's okay, because the ones that hit are really going to hit. The IT people are a different side, right? IT people are about something that can last, because I'm going to be maintaining it for a long time. It's going to be about not failing, because every time I fail, I get hurt, right? Somebody beats me up for it, right? And so you've got two very different mindsets there. And so that's a challenge. And the where to get is set up some agile teams that can really work together to link you in there. It's not a silver bullet, but it's going to get you closer. Let me say that this is just a general challenge in organizations that let me control everything, because then I control it. We all know the joke, I'm from headquarters, I'm here to help you, is like one of the worst things you can ever hear, right? And there's a reason for that, because the minute you involve going across organizations, it slows things down and it limits your flexibility. So this is a general organizational thing. What you've highlighted, Angelique, is kind of one of the most stark differences between the CMO and the CIO.
Well, I think that you're right. There could be a whole new book just on answering that particular question. But something you were starting to touch on there, George, and this perhaps crosses over into another area of your life at MIT that I wanted to explore a little bit with you as well. You joined something called the JWell, and perhaps I'll ask you to explain in a moment what that is and what you're doing there and why you accepted that assignment. And perhaps while you're developing those ideas, you could also share with us some of the work that you've been doing, which we think is incredibly important, and we've been making use of in executive education around skills and what future skills are needed in the workforce in general, but also for the kinds of leaders and up and coming leaders, perhaps, who would be watching a conversation like this.
I've been studying digital transformation for a decade now, and the technology for the other side. And about 5 years ago, I was working with a fantastic group called the IDE here, and we were thinking about the question about what jobs will be there after the robots take over. And we all know what that conversation was about 5 years ago. We know now that the robots aren't going to eat every job, but they're eating pieces of a lot of jobs. And what's became really clear is organizations got good at digital transformation, but they have not been as good at helping the workers be ready for the changes that are coming in. And this became really clear to me that we needed more work on there. So that's how I got involved with the Jamil World Education Lab. What this is Mr. Jamil and their foundation have been very generous with MIT of launching labs to really take on major world challenges and try to find novel ways to solve them. Last year's Nobel Prize winners from a Jamil lab on the Poverty Action Lab. And what Community Jamil does is they found these organizations. This one's for education. How can we think about how digital can change education around the world to make it more accessible and better for people? I run workforce learning. I was asked to do there. And what we're trying to do is figure out everybody that's an adult. How can we get them the skills they need? How can we get the right skills? Our tagline, the right skills to the right people in the right way at scale. Peter, it's interesting, the question about how to get in there. We talk about career advice in what we're doing, and we need to, organizations can do a much better job of career advice. And yet sometimes these things just happen randomly. Peter, one of your folks had asked me to develop a course on Internet of Things as one of the first digital courses launched under a new platform. And as part of that, I went to one of our Internet of Things experts, who is a professor from mechanical engineering, but also happens to run open learning, digital, the open learning things that happen at MIT. He did a lecture for our course, and he convinced me to help start this lab going. And so those are the kinds of things that are hard to explain. They're hard to make happen, but you also want to take these opportunities and work with them.
So that's a kind of you're part of the digital transformation of our own organization.
There we go. Yeah.
But one of the themes, one of the areas of work that I know you have done some extensive research on, then again looking at employers and business and industry, are what are the key and the critical skills? And I know it's a very large report, but if you could summarize that, that would be very interesting.
So what we're doing is we're looking at 4 major topics that need to be solved if we're going to digitally transform workforce learning around the world. And one is career advice. We can all get better at career advice from school up through work. And there are good algorithms, but there are other ways to get at that, right? Career advice, career mentoring, that's number 1. Number 2 is changing the learning process. And I can talk more about that in a minute. And the last is changing the certification so we can recognize the skills people have. So those 3 problems need to be solved. And then there's an underlying challenge of the skill frameworks, the infrastructure that this can ride on, so we can have some standardization, some coordination across organizations. So we're doing research in all those areas. One I want to highlight, so when you talk about skills, the skill frameworks, about 3 years ago, somebody asked me, George, how do we teach soft skills? And I put on my good professor hat and I said, well, how do we define soft skills, right? And it turned out we looked out in our first day of looking and found a dozen frameworks. And then after looking a little bit more, we found 41 frameworks. And so what we did is we synthesized the frameworks. We did interviews to figure out what was missing in the frameworks. And we identified this idea of the human skills matrix. And what that is 24 skills that individuals need to thrive in today's environment. Those 24 are divided in a 2x2 because, of course, Peter, you and I are at a management school, right? So it has to have a 2x2. The top is doing, the bottom is leading, the left is me, the right is other people. And so these 24 are kind of in meta categories of how I think: critical thinking, creativity, comfort with ambiguity. Then there's interacting. How do I communicate? How do I collaborate? How do I build the right empathy? How do I build the right relationships? Then there's managing ourselves. There's certainly planning and organization, there's persistence, but there's also self-awareness and adaptability. And then on the other side, often missing from these soft skills frameworks, but they need to be there, is leadership. How strategic vision, how do we empower others? How do we manage projects and performance? And so I think that's where you're going with that question, Peter, is what are these human skills are out there? If you just want to, search MIT human skills matrix, you'll see these up here. And if that's useful for you, we find it a very interesting way to organize our thinking.
I think it's fascinating because, these are the core skills for this digital world. And as you said, there's so many of them are human skills. And so I'm curious that, the things come full circle. So, in your own journey, you got involved in this work with JWell. How has that come back and informed the teaching that you do in our executive education programs and in the Sloan School?
Well, what's fascinating is when I was an engineer making radars, when I first got out of college, I had this mindset that organizations would work so much better if you just took all the people out of them. And because people to me were a hindrance. I needed something done and they were in the way. And then I got my doctorate in innovation and now I've been doing stuff. And as you said, Peter, as I've been getting more involved in here, what's happening is my research is moving much more towards people, much more towards the culture, the learning, the motivation elements of these transformation topics. So for example, we did some very interesting work on how can traditional companies get a digital enough culture to work in Sloan Management Review. And you don't have to copy. In fact, you shouldn't copy the Googles and the Netflixes of the world. But there's some really good things you can do about building the agility and thinking differently about customers. Did some work on how organizations need to digitally transform their learning and development processes. We call it the Transformer Chief Learning Officer. And getting at this concept that while companies have changed, the learning and development groups have not. And how can they get more partnership in there? How can they make a better experience and also improve the way that they deliver for their companies? And now we're moving into this workforce learning, trying to launch a big new effort that may be interesting to talk about.
That's perhaps a really great highlight to take a pause on because it's very future oriented as well. And I was just looking at my clock and the big list of comments and questions on the other side of my screen. I was going to just share that one of the practices that we've been experimenting with in my team and in the Sloan School for this sort of new digital way of working is to try to take an hour meeting and finish it in 45 minutes so that we all get 15 minutes within which to actually go and do something with what we talked about in the meeting or just to get away from the screen or do something that isn't staring at the screen and at videos of each other the whole time. So maybe I should try to put that into practice and ask you sort of a final question, George, which we've done this enough times, has become a bit of a tradition. And that is, if we're giving everybody 15 minutes who's watching this live now back in their calendar, what would you recommend they do with that 15 minutes to move the ball a little bit further up the field on their own digital transformation journey?
What I would suggest is to really think about what is inhibiting your ability to innovate, to engage with your customers. Think hard about that. Is it the assumptions? Is it other things? And then think also hard about how you work with your technology people to get those done. It's easy to blame other people for these things not getting done. And what we've learned over the years is it's the context that you're in is what really needs to be blamed. So how can you affect that context and move forward? Be clear on what you want. Think differently about how that context can work so you can work with your technology people to deliver great things.
That's sage advice. And thank you so much, George, and to everybody who's listening live. Perhaps if you've now got 10 or 15 minutes clear in your calendar that you weren't expecting, you could use it to put into practice that very powerful suggestion that George just made. George, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Peter, can I say one more thing, though?
Of course.
Can I say one more thing before we go?
Of course.
One other thing you can do with 15 minutes is go on the Sloan Management Review, Sloan Exec Ed website and sign up for our courses. And I can certainly recommend one that Courtney just put in there, this Essential IT for the Non-IT Executives course. We're teaching that very soon, but we teach it a couple times a year. We'd love to see you in the class.